Happy Hanukkah, everybody, and welcome to tonight's Shir, Insights into Hanukkah Part 2. But we're going to first take a little bit of a look also at this week's Torah portion, because the two themes invariably intertwine with each other, as we'll demonstrate. Portion of Mikhail. It details the continuing saga of Joseph and his brothers. Joseph's brothers, of course, are now faced with a situation whereby they are forced by the famine that gripped the land of Canaan and all of the Middle East to travel essentially to the only country that had food, namely Egypt. And it is there that they come face to face once again with their now long lost brother, Joseph, who is the viceroy of Egypt. He recognizes them. They, however, didn't realize that the Egyptian viceroy was indeed the very brother they had sold 22 years earlier. Commentaries make a simple observation and tell us that obviously they were already much older when they sold him, so they were already sprouting beards and whatnot, hence they were readily recognizable. But he was so much younger at the time, he was only 17. So now 22 years later, when he is 39, obviously he looks older, he has a beard, they don't readily recognize him. Mystically, it is suggested something more than that, and that is that going to the core of the tension between Yosef and his brothers, they understand just from his very dreams that he somehow envisages merging both worlds, the material world and the spiritual world. And as far as they're concerned, they, much like their father and their grandfather or their great-grandfather, were shepherds, people who didn't have to involve themselves too much in the materialism of this world, such that they were able to concentrate more on their own spiritual nurturing and development. So when they see Joseph right now, there's no way they would have recognized him. They can't imagine somebody who was able to merge both worlds. I mean, Joseph was still referred to as Yosef HaTzadik, or Yosef the righteous. He managed to maintain his lofty spiritual stature, whilst at the same time being as engrossed as anybody, and even more so in the bare bones materialism of Egyptian economy. He's the one who kept it afloat. So they don't recognize that because they can't acknowledge. And that really goes to the core of the tension between them and him, that one can actually merge both worlds together. But coming back to the story, he immediately accuses them, of course, of being spies. And when they repeat to him and communicate over to him their whole family history, mentioning that they had left a younger brother behind, Yosef seizes the opportunity. That is to say, in order to prove their truthfulness, he orders one of the brothers to be held hostage, Shimon, till the rest of the brothers would return with Benjamin, the youngest sibling that they claim to have at home. And when the brothers return home, Yaakov chides them. Why did you even tell him about Benjamin? Why did you reveal the whereabouts of my only lone surviving son from my beloved Rachel? And of course, he was reluctant to allow them to bring Benjamin to Egypt, citing his fears for his son's safety. But the brothers, they convinced Yaakov that there was no other option. And finally, he sent them off with the following blessing. If it must be so, then take of the land's glory in your baggage and bring it down to the man as a tribute, a bit of balsam, a bit of honey, some wax, lotus, pistachios, almonds, etc. Take your brother and arise, return to the man. And then he says, and may Almighty God give you mercy in front of the man, that he may release to you your other brother as well as Benjamin. And as for me, as I have been bereaved, so I am bereaved. In other words, que sera, sera, let the chips fall where they may. Let's hope it all works out. Note those words. May the Almighty give to you mercy in front of the man. Strange. Why is Yaakov praying that the Almighty give the brothers mercy? What he should have said is, he should have prayed, may God give Joseph, or may God give this viceroy mercy for you or unto you, saying, may God let the man have mercy upon you. Why is Jacob asking God to bestow the brothers with mercy? May Almighty God give to you mercy in front of the man, rather than saying, may the Almighty bestow the attribute of mercy upon this antagonistic man, this antagonistic viceroy whom you're soon to face. And something of an answer lies in the following anecdote. There was a great rabbi called Rabbi Yosef Chaim Sonnenfeld, who used to tell the story of the Rav of Shadik in Poland in the early 19th century, early 20th century. He was a newly appointed rabbi when he was warned of a particular Jew who attended shul, what was known as a government informer. And he used to actually strong-arm the previous rabbi and the community leaders into giving him high honors in the shul and into allowing him to lead the rituals and so on and so forth. And this Rav of Shadik, this new Rav, he would stand for none of this. When the man was typically called for the most significant call-up, the sixth aliyah, on the first Shabbos that he was now the rabbi, he made his way from his seat, that is the rabbi, on the eastern wall of the synagogue, went to the bima and started to shout, "Where do you think you're going? You're known as an informant to the government. That is of the worst crimes that a Jew can commit. How dare you show your face in the synagogue, let alone take an aliyah? Get out of the shul." And the man, of course, freezes in horror. And then before storming out of the synagogue, he shook his fist at the rabbi and he says, "I'll yet teach you a lesson." Several months later, the Rav of Shadik, who was also in Mikhail, was on his way to perform a circumcision somewhere. He was about a mile or so outside the city when suddenly a wagon containing the informer overtook his own coach. And the informer jumped to the footrest of the wagon. And whilst the rabbi's two students recoiled in fear, the man threw himself in front of the rabbi and started to beg for forgiveness from the entire community. And the rabbi later explained, King Solomon, Shlomo HaMelech tells us, like a reflection in the water, so is the face of man to man. In other words, from the moment after I admonished this fellow, all I did was try to find out about his good qualities. And then I concentrated my hardest on creating a deep love for this Jew. And that love would eventually exude from my soul. So when this informer saw me today, he suddenly felt and experienced that love that I had for him, like the reflection of water. So is the heart of man to man. He felt it and he reciprocated. And as he felt the same way about me as I did for him, he understood himself suddenly his own terrible misdeeds of his past life, and he repented with a sincere heart. It's only through that love that he repented and we became endeared to each other. And here's the point. Yaakov explains to his children, in order for the viceroy to have mercy upon you, you're going to have to approach him with mercy as well. And thus he says, may Almighty God give to you mercy in front of the man. Sometimes it is we who must fill our own hearts with love in order to get that same love and mercy back in return. Indeed, as we find later, as the whole epic saga of Joseph and his brothers reaches a climax in next week's portion, suddenly we're told that Joseph is no longer able to contain himself. And he discloses his identity to his brothers. What changed? I mean, until that point, he's being belligerent, he's being antagonistic, he's trying to teach them a lesson, and all of a sudden something changes. What? Explains one of the classic commentaries, the Or HaChaim HaKadosh, Judah, the brother who challenged him, changed. Judah started off all aggressive, all confrontational, and maintained that same stance that came to so personify the brothers. And Joseph, of course, is proportionately defiant. But then Judah changes tactic to acting endearingly towards Joseph, whereby, again, as per the reflection in the water, so is the heart of man to man. That in turn drew out the essence of Joseph, where he was unable to resist. He could no longer contain himself. And so hence Jacob actually prays that you should all find mercy in your hearts towards Joseph, notwithstanding however difficult this viceroy is portraying himself, and that will evoke the same from him. There's the point. Imagine trying to impact the life of another person. If you regard them as forlorn, if you look down upon them, you cannot hope to change what you believe to be a lost cause. But if you view somebody in a positive light, if you consider them to be the same as you, holy, precious, a tired neshama, as we say, a precious soul, then you draw them out and invariably you can make a dramatic difference in their life. And that's the way it works in all of our interactions, whether with our children, with our spouses, and in the world beyond. How do I change my life? How do I steer myself back onto a brighter path? Right now, the picture may be gloomy. You've got to change it to something bright. And then you've got to learn how to inhabit that space. You are the casting director. This world is your movie. You are making reality. Whatever picture you put into the projector, that's what this world becomes. Ultimately, by changing the inner attitudes of our minds, we can change the outer aspects of our lives. And when you change your life, from there on, you can go to change the world. Now, almost every year on the week of Hanukkah, this week's Torah portion of Mikhail is read. And there's this clear significance that the fact that it's always read on Hanukkah means that there must be a connection between the story of Mikhail, Joseph and his brothers, and the Hanukkah story. What is it? Well, let's consider again how the Torah relays about the famine in the land, how the brothers go down to the only country that was spared from the hunger in Egypt, and that through the brilliant vision, organization, and planning of a young Hebrew slave known to the Egyptians as Safnat Paneach, that country fed itself and the world. Now, the brothers are ushered into this prodigal viceroy's chambers. And we know in the first instance, like we said, he acted towards them like a total mashugana. He accused them of a heinous plot to spy on Egypt. He incarcerated Shimon. He forced them to bring the youngest brother, the orphan child of an aged father. He wanted to teach his brothers a lesson for having sold him. But here's the question. If he wanted to teach his brothers a lesson, if he wanted to punish them for selling him, why doesn't he just do so openly and directly? Guys, this is me, and guess what? I'm in charge, and I'm going to lock you up now, or I insist on this, or I insist on whatever it is. Why doesn't he just come straight out with it? Why is he engaging in this seemingly senseless charade? Hanukkah is symbolized by the menorah. It represents a miracle. A small amount of oil, enough for one day, lasted for 8. But there were greater miracles. A small army of Kohanim priests who were previously involved in only spirituality and had virtually no experience in battle defeated the Greek army. Why don't we make a parade or a feast to celebrate a major victory? Why is the main commemoration over a little oil? One of my favorite stories is that of a small village where there lived a poor groom, unable to afford a proper tailor to make him a wedding suit. So he brought material to a second-rate tailor. And when he came to collect on the day of his wedding, he is shocked to see the results. That one sleeve was 6 inches too short. So the tailor says, okay, so pull your arm in a little bit. But the other sleeve is half a foot too long. He says, so extend your arm through that one. And what about the trousers? The groom screams, the left leg is twisted. Oh, that's nothing. Just hop down the aisle with your knees slightly bent, and et cetera, et cetera. And at the wedding, you can imagine all the guests gathered there were utterly stunned and shocked as they see this poor groom hobbling to the chuppah in the hand like this and a hand like that and a foot like this and a foot like that. And they're thinking to themselves, Nebuch, what a pity, what a rachmanis, what a terribly disfigured man. But his tailor, wow, what a genius. And here's the point. Yosef had a very important message to send his brothers. More than a decade ago, you sat in judgment on me. You thought you made a brilliant decision and were smarter than anyone else, including your own father. You decided to sell me as a slave. Now you meet essentially the most brilliant savior of the generation, the man who saved the world from starvation, and you see him as acting like a paranoid maniac. He's accusing you of something that is so hallucinatory that you think he is a madman. Is it not possible to think that perhaps you also made a gross error in judgment? Is it not possible that you saw a situation in a twisted light? Is it the boy or is it the suit that is actually twisted? Joseph showed his brothers that even the best and brightest can misinterpret any situation. That's why he behaved the way that he did. When our sages tell us, don't judge someone until you are in their place. What does in their place mean? Simply put, it means the same circumstances as those of the other individual. But at a deeper level, it says that even if you are in the same set of given circumstances, you don't know the makeup of his or her soul. And unless you are of identical disposition, how can one's soul possibly judge another? Our missions in life are not the same. Why is somebody failing when we're not failing? Because that's his area of vulnerability, and we're not vulnerable in that same specific area. Success is only an achievement for the soul with the challenge. There's nothing remarkable about being able to walk, but it is an achievement for a lame man to walk. For a man who is not lame to compare his walking to a man on crutches is not only inappropriate, it's foolish. In other words, we criticize other people because we make a judgmental decision about that person's inability to function in comparison to our ability to function in the same given situation. How unfair is that? It's like expecting a 6-year-old to lift a suitcase because it's not heavy for you as an adult. So a fundamental problem with people's inability to deal with one another's failings is that they measure those failings against their own strengths. The only judge can be God himself, because only he knows with which strengths and weaknesses each soul began. And Hanukkah delivers a very similar message. The sages are not interested in commemorating a battlefield victory. They had a more powerful message for us. Nothing in this world can be judged at face value. A bit of oil that decidedly could only last one day may end up lasting much longer. They want us to remember that outward appearances, as the opinions of pundits, have no bearing on reality. And when that message is understood, it's easy to understand that a small army of priests can topple a mighty force. We can understand that we may be viewed as weak, or frankly, what may be viewed as weak and what may be viewed as strong, and what we thought was insufficient is actually plenty, and what we think is weak is really strong. And that little bit of oil, like a pesky younger brother, both of whom you thought wouldn't amount to anything, can really light the way. Now, in the Talmud, following on the theme of Hanukkah, Rabbi Tanchum rules that whoever lights a Hanukkah or a Hanukkah menorah that is taller than 20 amot, which is essentially 30 feet, has not fulfilled the mitzvah. A candle at that height cannot be seen by a passerby. It's too high up, and therefore it would not contribute to publicizing the miracle of Hanukkah, which is a primary objective of the lighting of the menorah. The basic purpose of the menorah is to be a beacon for passersby to see, so that they'll be stirred to the message of Hanukkah. So yes, even when you see the giant one or in Golders Green or wherever else, it's actually up to 30 feet, but not more. But then immediately afterwards, what seems like a very strange juxtaposition, that law of Rabbi Tanchum is followed by another statement by Rabbi Tanchum concerning the biblical story of Joseph and the description of the pit that he was thrown into by his brothers. The biblical text uses a very unusual duplication of language to describe the pit. The verse says the pit was empty and it had no water in it. Ask Rabbi Tanchum, if it had no water, don't we know that it was empty? Or more precisely, if it was empty, it obviously had no water in it. And his answer is that the duplication tells us that the pit was empty, yes, but only of water. But it did contain other things, namely snakes and scorpions. Our question is, why the insertion of this strange biblical verse in the middle of a discussion about the festival of Hanukkah? The whole page of Talmud there is talking all about the laws of Hanukkah and why we celebrate Hanukkah and everything about Hanukkah. And then the quote from Rabbi Tanchum teaching us the law that a Hanukkah menorah cannot be higher than 30 feet. And then another quote from Rabbi Tanchum to tell us that Joseph's pit indeed was empty of water, but had snakes and scorpions. I mean, what's the juxtaposition here? What's going on? And I suppose something of an answer has to lie in the fact that that verse appears in the Torah portion that is always read the Shabbat of the week of Hanukkah, whether it's the Shabbat preceding the week in which Hanukkah falls, as was the case this year, or the Shabbat of Hanukkah itself, which clearly suggests that there's a hidden link to Hanukkah. And there are really three basic explanations. The first is a practical one. Reuven, the oldest brother, suggested that Joseph be thrown into the pit because he intended to come back later to rescue him. Now, if there were snakes and scorpions in the pit, and no way for Reuven to assume that a miracle would be performed, that Joseph somehow would remain unharmed from them, then I mean, with friends or brothers like that, who needs anything else? And you're saving him from your other brothers wanting to kill him by suggesting to throw him in the pit with intent to come rescue him later. Meanwhile, this pit's got snakes and scorpions. What are you doing? You're saving him from your brother's murderous plot and throwing him into a killing pit instead. Where's the sense in that? Well, let's consider how deep was the pit. The wording of the verse is, and they threw him. Vayashlech, they threw Yosef into the pit. In Hebrew, vayashlech. There is a Mishnah which discusses about the rituals conducted in the temple. And one of those rituals involved hashlacha, vayashlech, throwing something onto the altar. And the commentaries make the point that whenever we find this idea of throwing, it implies no less than 30 feet. In fact, we find a similar idea, a similar comment on a verse in Psalms where it talks about throwing onto God your burdens, where he will look after you. So too over here then, when they threw Yosef into the pit, it can be assumed whenever you find that word, and they threw, that it was no less than 30 feet. And there would have been snakes and scorpions, but just like we talk about a menorah, beyond 30 feet being something that is out of your view, then here if the pit, Vayashlech, and he threw, which implies at least 30 feet, the snakes and scorpions would have been out of Reuven's view. And therefore he wouldn't have known. And that's what he assumed. It would have been a safe bet to throw Yosef there with intent to rescue him later. That's just a practical explanation. But let's look at it from a spiritual perspective in juxtaposing these seemingly disconnected statements. Rabbi Tanchum expresses the whole message of the festival of Hanukkah. Because, physics teaches that nature abhors a vacuum. No space in the physical world remains empty. It's filled with something, even if it's just air. And that's true spiritually as well. Your mind is never neutral. If you don't fill the mind and heart with positive energy, then negative influences, or snakes and scorpions, metaphorically speaking, if you will fill the void instead. Now, water in the Jewish tradition is often used as a symbol for Torah, because both water and Torah are sources of life. Rabbi Tanchum's interpretation of the verse is not about Joseph's pit alone. It's a lesson about all of our lives. When there is no water, when there is no spiritual sustenance, then there will be snakes and scorpions. When we don't take the time and energy to fill our lives with a tradition that teaches us, nourishes us, sustains us, and allows us to keep growing throughout our lives, then we run the risk that our lives will be filled instead with things that threaten us and do us harm. Or to put this in down-to-earth language, the mind is like tofu. On its own, it has no taste. Everything depends on the marinade it is immersed in. So you see, the human mind is eminently social. It takes on the flavor of the cultural environment in which it is immersed. People pick up mannerisms or accents or habits of speech and ultimately behavior. In the Hanukkah story, the Greeks wanted to inculcate the Jewish people, the Jewish mind, with Hellenistic culture, snakes and scorpions of the mind, if you will. But the Maccabees rebelled because they didn't want to marinate in the Hellenistic culture, which was vulgar, it was violent, it was destructive. The Greeks attempted to force their values on the Jewish people, so therefore Torah study was outlawed on pain of death. The Greeks understood that as long as the Jews are going to be nurtured by the wellsprings of Torah, they wouldn't be able to vanquish the Jew or Judaism. And we too live in a society that has every bit in effect on us, for good or otherwise. Like the Maccabees, we can choose to be discriminating about what thoughts we engage in. And those thoughts and those actions that we choose will define us. They'll come to be what we talk of, what we dream of, and ultimately who we are. And one final point in this, Reuven rationalized that what will transpire in the end is not in his hands. His responsibility is to do whatever he could with whatever means were available to him at the present moment. By casting Yosef into the pit, he was at least delaying Yosef's fate from a hasty death at the hands of his brothers. From there on in, it was in the hands of God. And here again, a vital life lesson. We cannot determine the outcome of our actions and efforts. Our responsibility is to ensure that we have at least invested as much as we are able. If we've done our part, then we can be feeling comfortable leaving the rest up to God. That was the battle plan of the Hazmatians, the Hashmonaim. Why did they even try to fight a highly equipped and trained army? And the answer is that the Hazmatians saw the spiritual and physical carnage that the Greeks wrought, including their decrees, again, outlining Torah study, the fulfillment of Shabbat, circumcision, etc. They knew they couldn't overcome such a powerful army, but they still felt they had to do their part. They resisted against the small force in Modi'in because that they felt they could do. They continued each step of the way, doing only as much as they were able. God miraculously took them the rest of the way, took them the rest of the distance, ensuring that their efforts would prove sufficient despite the odds. That is why Rabbi Tanchum juxtaposes these two events. Like Reuven, the Hazmanians pushed themselves to the limit, and God took care of the rest. Bearing these lessons in mind, as you gaze and look at the kindle of Hanukkah candles, remember to open your mind and open your heart to the warm light of tradition and meaningful values. Recognize that the light atop of the menorah reflects the light that burns within our own souls. We have to do our part to light our inner candles, and then we ensure to leave it to God to keep the candles burning going forward. I wish you all a happy Hanukkah, Shabbat Shalom, and a beautiful week ahead.